is the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Quiche Maya, and how did it end up in the Newberry Library in Chicago, Illinois? But first off, who are the Quiche Maya? These are the indigenous Mayan people who are still around today. They lived in present-day Belize, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, as well as parts of southern Mexico, in the present-day Mexican states of Campeche, Chiapas, Quintana Roo, and Yucatan. And again, keep in mind that the Quiche Maya are just one of many Mayan indigenous groups that are still around today. To answer this first question, what is it? What is the Popol Vuh? This refers to a text, a colonial text that contains Quiche Maya creation stories that were passed down orally. And they were, of course, preserved in Latin script. The main protagonists in this story are referred to as the hero twins, and the book describes their battles with the divine entities who ruled the underworld known as Xibalba. According to the Newberry Library's website, I think they say it best, the Popol Vuh, which has been translated as the Book of the Council, the Book of the Community, Book of the People, and the Sacred Book, it's the creation account of the Quiche Mayan people. Popol is also defined as woven mat, and Vuh as the book. And the text weaves together Mayan stories concerning cosmologies, origins, traditions, and spiritual histories. It's considered by many Mayans as their equivalent to the Christian Bible, and it is held in deep reverence by them. The text known as the Popol Vuh today was recorded by a Spanish missionary, Francisco Jimenez, from approximately 1700 to 1715 in Chichicastenango, Guatemala. And he was a priest who belonged to the mendicant order known as the Dominicans. And interestingly, he recorded this text in both the Quiche Mayan language and in the Spanish language. It's hard to see here, but there's the Mayan version on the left here, and on the right here, this is the Spanish translation of the Mayan text. It should be noted, according to the Newberry Library, that some scholars believe that Jimenez's copy was probably prepared in the 16th century by a native speaker who had been taught Latin characters. The earlier forms of the text were codices or screenfolds with glyphs as aids memoirs. The text, which almost appears to be free verse, was clearly designed to be presented orally. Jimenez's transcription of the Quiche is studded with corrections. It's possible that the text was recited possibly by as many as 3 people, which would account for some of the repetition and strikeouts. I'll talk a little more about Jimenez in part 2.
So what do we know about Francisco Jimenez, who is the compiler of the text of the Quiche Maya creation stories known as the Popol Vuh, and how would his background influence the Popol Vuh narrative? It should be pointed out that the Popol Vuh narrative, as Nestor Quiroa points out, it's actually part of a larger collection composed by Jimenez. It was divided into 3 parts and known collectively as Las Historias del Origen de los Indios, or the history of the origin of the Indians. The first, which you can see here, was a grammar book for 3 different Mayan languages. The second was a catechism and confession guide, and the third is the larger historical mythological text, which contains a narrative known today as the Popol Vuh. But the Popol Vuh was not the title that Jimenez imposed. That's a modern title. And we also have to keep in mind that the Popol Vuh was not a standalone text. It was a one of many texts contained in this third part. According to Nestor Quiroa in his 2017 article on Friar Jimenez and on the Popol Vuh, Jimenez arrived to Guatemala in 1688 and he became an ordained priest in 1689 in San Vicente de Chiapas. And while he was in Guatemala, we learned that he had many positions. He would also go on to learn several Mayan languages, such as Quiche, and quotes also acquired a deep knowledge of the culture, traditions, and religious beliefs of the region. And of course, his most important contribution was his Spanish language translation of the Quiche stories we know today as the Popol Vuh. Now, you might be wondering, why is there a Catholic missionary who's interested in recording these stories that he otherwise would have considered devil worship or idolatry? As best stated by Quiroa, he was aware of the significance of these stories for Quiche spirituality, and in his thinking, to have a truthful conversion in the Guatemalan highlands, these stories required eradication. So in other words, it was important for the first to know these Mayan stories in order to help their efforts to get rid of them. And Jimenez says it himself in the introduction to the Popol Vuh narrative. The translation of this opening title is "Thus begin the creation stories of the Indians of this province of Guatemala," translated from Quiche into Spanish for the convenience of the ministers of the Holy Gospel. So this text was written for the Catholic missionaries, not for the general public. There's also reason to suspect that Jimenez may have incorporated Christian elements into the Popol Vuh. So for example, he credits many of these stories to satanic influence. And the Popol Vuh also contains, perhaps suspiciously, the story of the flood, which is said to have destroyed the worlds of one of the earliest humans recorded in the Popol Vuh. Which may have been a nod from Jimenez to the story of Noah's Ark. Quiroa's 2017 article also mentions how others like the Guatemalan scholar Daniel Contreras and the Mexican ethnographer Rene Acuña, that they suggested that the Popol Vuh was an apocryphal text. And Contreras pointed out how the Popol Vuh contained hidden biblical themes.
We also need to point out that Jimenez could not have written this text without the help of his Quiche Maya informants.
They were elites who had vested political interests in telling their version of this creation story that not only validated them as the ruling elite, but also their history. Now, all of this is not to suggest that the Popol Vuh is a farce. This means that we do have to keep in mind these factors when we are reading Jimenez's text at face value. So yes, it does have pre-Hispanic Mayan elements, but we should not assume here that the finished product is a purely Mayan text.
So can you find the original written version of the Popol Vuh at the Newberry Library, like right now? And the answer is yes. And the story of how it got there, it's a little bit shady and also complicated. The first thing we have to remember is that Jimenez did not record the Popol Vuh as a separate book. The Popol Vuh narrative was only part of part 3 of his 3-part series known as Las Historias del Origen de los Indios. Make sure to check out part 2 for that explanation. Sometime from 1829 to 1830, after the Dominicans were kicked out of Guatemala, the book ended up at the Universidad de San Carlos, which is considered Guatemala's oldest university. As Nestor Quiroa's 2017 article points out, Jimenez's manuscript was brought there as a result of the liberal government's policies of confiscating church properties. Flash forward a few decades later, from 1852 to 1855. This German collector Moritz Wagner and the natural scientist Carl von Scherzer, they both study Father Jimenez's text together with the help of the archivist and historian Juan Gavarete, who works there at San Carlos University. According to Quiroa, Scherzer was particularly interested in discovering ancient texts. They got permission to copy the contents of the text and were able to publish a book based on what they copied back in Europe. They did keep Father Jimenez's original title for the text, Historias del Origen de los Indios. But in 1855, knowledge of Father Jimenez's book also reaches this guy. His name?
Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg.
Thank you, Google Translate. Some argue that he stole the entire 3-part book while he was in the Guatemalan city of Rabinal and took it back to France for further study. There is one author that has evidence that he probably purchased the text from an Ignacio Coloch, but depending on how you interpret this and what your understanding of ethics and archives is, you might consider this text stolen or you might consider it purchased fair and square. Let me know what you think in the comments. In 1861, he went on to publish his version of the Quiche Maya creation stories found in part 3 as
Popol Vuh, le livre sacré et les mythes de l'Antiquité américaine,
which you can also access on the Library of Congress website digitally, by the way. After Bourbourg died, Las Historias del Origen de los Indios was then passed on to the French scholar and collector Alphonse Louis Pinart. Alphonse then went on to sell it to Edward Everett Ayer. He was a U.S. businessman and also a collector of books and artifacts related to indigenous peoples in the Americas. In 1897, Ayer donated his collections to the Newberry Library in Chicago, including Father Jimenez's Historias del Origen de los Indios, which contains, of course, the Popol Vuh narrative, and it is now kept there to this day. So how did part 3 become the most famous and singled out as the Popol Vuh? More of this in part 4.